On July 17, 1999, at 5:40 a.m., two climbers signed in at the ranger station at Mount Rainier National Park, Washington. Their names were Rachel Moore, 29, and Evan Cole, 32. It was clear, cold, and the forecast called for only light winds. Less than 24 hours later, Evan would come back alone, frostbitten and barely able to stand. Rachel would never hike out. For years, the official line said she vanished into the glacier and could not be recovered. But 20 years later, during an abnormal melt season, the mountain exposed evidence that did not match Evan's story. The question is simple. What really happened to Rachel Moore on Mount Rainier? Rachel's disappearance did not start as a mystery. On that July morning, their plan looked like hundreds of other weekend climbs. They logged their intended route on the Emmons Glacier. They showed standard gear: rope, harnesses, helmets, crampons, radios, overnight packs. Rangers noted nothing unusual in the log. Evan chatted briefly about weather patterns. Rachel signed her name in quick, neat handwriting and smiled for the hallway camera. They left the parking lot just after sunrise. The first part of the approach was routine. Other climbers later remembered seeing a couple moving steadily, not rushed, keeping a normal pace. According to the records, the last confirmed sighting of both of them together was near a marked rest spot around 11:15 a.m. What came next, the storm, the fall, the night on the ice, exists only in Evan's words. When he staggered back into the ranger station the next day, he reported whiteout conditions and an open crevasse. He told them he fought through the night just to stay alive. His injuries matched exposure. His story fit what rangers had seen on other rescues. Search teams went out. They found nothing. No torn fabric, no broken gear, no trace of a fall. Within a week, the file shifted from active rescue to presumed fatality. For 2 decades, Rachel's name stayed in a thin folder in a steel cabinet. 20 years later, her case came back to life with a single phone call from the glacier. 20 years later, the ice finally answered for her. Rachel Moore grew up less than 2 hours from Mount Rainier. She knew the mountain as a landmark long before she ever roped up on ice. By 29, she was a registered nurse at a Tacoma hospital, working 12-hour shifts and picking up nights. Friends say she saved most of her vacation days for climbing season. Her car held a pair of worn boots, a helmet, and a stack of topo maps. Evan Cole's path looked different on paper. He was 32 in 1999, a civil engineer with a Seattle firm. Coworkers described him as precise, competitive, and very sure of his own judgment. He joined a local alpine club in his 20s and moved quickly into leadership roles. He taught weekend glacier travel classes. People trusted him on snow. Rachel met Evan at one of those classes 3 years before the climb. At first, the match made sense. She wanted a partner who took risks seriously. He liked being the person others relied on. They started dating within months. By 1998, they were sharing most weekends, either at his apartment in Seattle or on trails around the Cascades. Underneath that, small cracks formed. Rachel's younger sister Laura remembered late-night phone calls about arguments. Evan wanted them to move in together and talk marriage. Rachel was not ready. She worried about how easily he checked her mileage log after trips. He seemed to dislike any climb she did without him. Once, at a gear shop in Tacoma, he confronted a male friend who hugged Rachel hello. Staff later told Laura they still remembered the scene years later. Still, Rachel kept trying to make it work. She told Laura that the July 1999 Rainier trip might settle things in her mind. If it felt solid, she would finally agree to move in. If it did not, she planned to end the relationship when they came back. A week before they signed in at the ranger desk, Evan updated the park paperwork. He listed only himself as Rachel's emergency contact. Laura's name, which had been on earlier forms, disappeared without any explanation. If you pay attention to long-buried cases like this one, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. For Laura, that small change would later feel like the first real warning sign. According to the official record, the climb itself began smoothly. After signing in at 5:40 a.m., Rachel and Evan left the parking lot within 30 minutes. A ranger noted them passing the last stand of trees around 7 a.m., moving at a normal pace. By mid-morning, they were on firm snow, roped together with about 30 feet between them, heading toward the Emmons Glacier route they had listed on their permit. Several other climbers later confirmed brief sightings. One party saw them near a marked rest spot around 11:15 a.m. Rachel sat on her pack, drinking from a blue Nalgene bottle. Evan stood a few feet away, studying a folded map and checking his altimeter. Nothing in those moments suggested trouble. No one reported raised voices or visible stress. By noon, light clouds started to build over the upper mountain, which is common in July. Everything that follows comes from Evan's later statement. He told investigators that conditions deteriorated rapidly after 1:30 p.m. He described wind picking up, visibility dropping, and fine snow blowing sideways. By his account, they kept moving because they were not far from a flat area where guided groups often camped. Rachel was still in front on the rope. Evan said he called out distances, reminding her to test the snow with her axe. He claimed the accident happened just after 3 p.m. He felt a hard pull on the rope, then a jolt forward. In his words, the surface under Rachel just disappeared. He said he drove his ice axe into the slope and kicked his crampons in, performing a textbook self-arrest. According to him, the tension on the rope lasted only a second or two. Then it went slack. He told rangers he crawled toward the edge, lying on his stomach and shouting Rachel's name into what looked like a narrow, dark opening. In the storm, he said he heard nothing from below. No cry, no impact, only wind. He reported staying near the supposed crevasse for at least an hour, sweeping the rope side to side, but never feeling it catch on her weight. At some point, he admitted, he unclipped himself from the rope and left it anchored to a snow picket. He did not mark the spot with a wand, flag, or GPS point. As darkness approached, he dug a shallow snow cave and waited out the night alone. Just over 24 hours later, Evan would walk back into the ranger station with frostbitten hands and a story that, for 2 decades, almost everyone believed. The first official response to Rachel's disappearance began at 7:10 a.m. on July 18, 1999. A ranger at the White River Station logged Evan's arrival as severely cold, disoriented, reporting partner missing on Emmons Glacier. His hands were pale and swollen. His lips were cracked. A volunteer medic recorded a core temperature just above 95 degrees. While they wrapped him in blankets and started warm fluids, another ranger sat beside the cot and took his initial statement. Evan repeated the same sequence he would later formalize. Afternoon storm. Sudden fall. A dark opening in the snow. No response from Rachel. Long hours alone in a shallow shelter. Every few minutes, the ranger stopped him to clarify times and locations. Evan's answers stayed within the same narrow window. He said the fall happened around 3, at a point above the main camp area. He could not give a precise elevation. By 8:30 a.m., search and rescue teams were already moving up the mountain. Helicopter crews flew pattern sweeps along the Emmons route. Ground teams moved on ropes, probing for hidden crevasses with long aluminum poles. Visibility was limited at first, but improved through the day. Rescuers marked potential hazards with wands and flags. They did not find a fresh break in the snowpack, where Evan said Rachel disappeared. The search continued for 4 full days. Teams used dogs when conditions allowed. They lowered cameras into several openings that matched his general description. Each time, the images showed only blue ice and packed snow. No clothing, no helmet, no sign of a pack or rope. On July 22nd, the Park Service held a brief press update. An official spokesperson told reporters there was no realistic chance of survival after that much time in those temperatures. The file for Rachel more changed from rescue to recovery, then to presumed fatality. Evan left the hospital within a week. He did not attend the small gathering Laura organized at the trailhead the following month. According to phone records, he called her once, for less than 3 minutes, on the night before that memorial. For Laura, that silence was the first thing that never quite fit. For almost a decade, Rachel's case stayed frozen in Laura Moore's mind as a terrible accident she could not change. Then, around 2008, a small detail shook loose. Laura requested a copy of the incident file from Mount Rainier National Park. It arrived in a thin envelope. The initial ranger notes, the formal interview with Evan, the search maps, and a brief medical summary. One line in the medical report caught her eye. Under injuries, it listed only moderate frostbite to fingers and toes, mild hypothermia, and superficial abrasions. Laura was not a climber, but she had watched enough climbing videos and read enough articles to understand basic rope use. The file confirmed that Rachel and Evan were roped together on a glacier. Rachel weighed around 140 pounds with her pack. Laura wondered how a fall big enough to erase a person could happen on a rope without leaving a mark on the climber who stayed on the surface. She called an old friend of Rachel's, Mark Lewis, who had guided on Rainier in the late 1990s. She laid out the scenario in neutral terms, without names. Two climbers roped together. The front climber falls into a narrow opening. The rear climber arrests and survives, but has no rope burns, no shoulder injury, no deep bruising from a violent pull. Mark did not hesitate. He told her that in most real falls, the person on top pays a price. They get dragged, slammed, or yanked hard. Skin and gear show it. He said, if he really held her fall, you would see it on his body and on the harness. Laura went back to the ranger notes. Evan had used phrases like scrambled for purchase and felt the rope go tight for a second. There was no mention of a failed anchor, a cut rope, or hardware damage. The rope itself was never recovered. In the interview, no one pressed him about how exactly he detached himself from a fallen partner in a storm. She wrote a detailed letter to the Park Service in 2009, outlining her concerns about the rope, the injuries, and the missing gear. The official response was polite and brief, saying there was no new evidence to justify reopening the case. Laura filed the letter away, but from that point on, she stopped using the word accident when she talked about her sister's death. In late August 2019, Washington State went through one of its hottest recorded summers. At Mount Rainier, guides and rangers watched the glaciers pull back day by day. On August 29th, a remote section of ice on the northeast side failed without warning. A massive block collapse and debris slide carved a new scar into the mountain. Seismometers picked it up as a small local event. For a few days, it was just another note in park logs about unstable terrain. A week later, on September 5, 2019, a local ski mountaineer named Kyle Jensen headed into that altered zone. He had guided on Rainier for years and was curious to see what the collapse had exposed. Kyle followed a GPS track along the edge of the new ice fall, moving slowly, testing each step with his poles. The area looked wrong to him. Clean blue ice faces were where snow slopes used to be. Pools of meltwater formed in shallow basins. From a distance, he saw a patch of color that did not fit the landscape. It was a dull red and gray shape lying half embedded in soft ice about 20 yards away. At first he thought it was a torn pack or a tent. As he got closer, he saw a jacket sleeve with a black elastic cuff. The fabric was shredded, but a human arm bone was clearly visible inside. Kyle later told investigators his first reaction was to back up and force himself to slow down. He took several photos from different angles. A few feet away, on bare ice, he noticed a plastic bottle partly frozen in place. The brand was from the late 1990s, with a logo design he had not seen in years. Near that, resting on its side, was a single heavy mountaineering boot with a metal crampon still strapped to it. He marked the coordinates on his GPS unit and turned around. Back at cell service, he called the park's non-emergency line, then followed up with an email, attaching the photos. Within 24 hours, a joint team of rangers and county deputies flew into the site by helicopter. One of the older rangers looked at the jacket color and the boot style and thought of a name he had not said out loud in a long time. The recovery team reached the site mid-morning on September 6, 2019. They followed Kyle Jensen back to the GPS point he had marked. Rangers established a small perimeter with flagged wands. A county detective activated his body camera before anyone touched the remains. The air temperature hovered just above freezing. Meltwater ran in thin lines across the ice. The first task was documentation. A forensic photographer walked slowly around the scene, taking wide shots, then close-ups. The jacket sleeve Kyle had seen was attached to a torn torso section, fused to the ice. The exposed arm bone was pale and dry in some places, darker where meltwater pooled. 3 ribs lay loose nearby. The boot with the attached crampon sat a few feet away, on cleaner ice, as if it had broken free at a different time. One ranger picked up the plastic bottle with gloved hands. The label was from a brand that had changed design around 2000. The cap was cracked. Inside was a small amount of discolored liquid. They bagged it, along with every bone fragment they could find. Each item got its own numbered bag and entry in the evidence log. The team worked for hours in short shifts, rotating to avoid cold stress and fatigue. The remains and gear went straight to the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Megan Ortiz received them later that day. She had worked countless mountain deaths but understood right away this one carried history. The intake form noted a potential link to a 1999 disappearance on Rainier. She began with the skull. It was largely intact but badly damaged in certain areas. She expected broad fractures from a fall. Instead, she saw several small, round defects clustered toward the top and back of the head. Under bright overhead lights, the pattern bothered her. The edges of the holes were sharp and focused, not radiating like impact from a long fall. There were also larger crushed sections that suggested repeated force from above. When technicians laid the recovered boot and crampon on a separate table, Megan asked for precise measurements of each front point. Then she measured the diameter of the skull defects herself and wrote the numbers side by side. The numbers lined up almost exactly. The front points of the crampon measured just under 1 centimeter across. The circular defects in the skull matched that diameter within fractions of a millimeter. Dr. Megan Ortiz checked the measurements twice, then had a colleague verify them again. She saw no way to explain the pattern as random damage from ice and rock. In her report, she wrote that the injuries were highly consistent with repeated blows from a crampon-type implement. She also noted that the damage was concentrated on the top and back of the head. That detail suggested the victim was either faced away or already down when the impacts occurred. The rest of the skeleton showed crushing from glacial movement, but those specific holes told a different story. Pierce County Detective Daniel Hart received the preliminary report on September 10, 2019. He pulled the old 1999 Moore file from storage and spread both sets of documents on his desk. One map showed the area where Evan had told rangers Rachel disappeared. A new map from Glaciology Consultants showed where the glacier would have carried a body over 20 years. The two zones did not overlap. According to the experts, a body lost where Evan claimed would not surface where Kyle found the remains. Hart then examined the photos of the boot recovered at the scene. It was a men's model, size 11, with a crampon still attached. Park logs confirmed that in 1999, Rachel wore smaller rental boots from the park gear shed. Evan wore his own equipment. The boot on the ice could not have belonged to Rachel. The detective requested any record of Rachel's climbing gear purchase history. A Tacoma outdoor shop still had an old customer database. Rachel had bought a jacket and gloves there, but never heavy boots or crampons. Hart concluded that the boot found beside her remains almost certainly matched Evan's kit from that climb. By the end of that week, the case changed category. On paper, it moved from presumed accidental death to suspicious death, potential homicide. For the first time, Evan Cole's name appeared in a Pierce County file not as a victim, but as a possible suspect. Detective Daniel Hart knew the boot on the ice was not enough by itself. He needed something that tied it directly to Evan Cole in 1999. Working with Seattle police, he pulled Evan's current address, office, and any property records. One entry stood out. Evan still paid a small monthly fee on a storage unit in an industrial strip south of the city. The rental contract had been active since 2001. On October 2, 2019, Hart and a Seattle detective served a warrant at that unit. The manager rolled up the metal door. Inside were stacked boxes, old furniture, and several large duffel bags. One bag, coated in dust and dirt, had a faded outdoor brand logo. Inside, officers found a coil of climbing rope, 2 ice axes, a harness, and a pair of leather mountaineering boots. Only one of those boots had a crampon still attached. Everything went to the Pierce County lab. The second crampon was photographed, measured, and compared with the one recovered near Rachel's remains. It was the same model, same color, and same strap configuration. Lab techs examined the front points under a microscope. They saw tiny chips and stress marks on 3 of the spikes. A forensic materials expert concluded that the pattern of damage fit repeated high-force contact with a hard but slightly flexible surface, like human bone. Meanwhile, Hart's team went back through Rachel and Evan's social circle. Former climbing partners described Evan as skilled but controlling. One recalled a 1998 trip where Evan erupted at Rachel for suggesting they turn back early. A friend from Evan's office remembered him tracking Rachel's solo hikes and complaining when she went with coworkers. Laura told Hart about the gear shop confrontation years earlier, and gave him copies of Rachel's old emails. In one message, written 10 days before the climb, Rachel told a friend she was tired of being managed and that Rainier might be her last trip with Evan. The picture forming in Hart's mind was simple and ugly. On paper, it now looked like motive, means, and opportunity all on the same rope. By mid-October 2019, Detective Daniel Hart believed he had enough to move beyond suspicion. He asked the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office for a case review. They met in a small conference room on the 4th floor, spreading photos and timelines across the table. One board showed Rachel's 1999 disappearance. Another showed the 2019 recovery site. A third held close-up shots of the skull injuries and the crampons. Hart walked the prosecutors through each point. The glaciology report stating Rachel's body could not have migrated from Evan's claimed location. Dr. Megan Ortiz's opinion that the head injuries matched repeated strikes from a crampon, not a fall. The men's boot with crampon beside the remains. The matching crampon in Evan's storage unit, with microscopic damage consistent with impact on bone. The communications from Rachel in the days before the climb, talking about ending the relationship. The pattern of control and anger described by friends. The prosecutors focused on one question. Would a jury, 20 years later, see this as proof beyond a reasonable doubt? There was no witness on the rope except Evan. There was no full rope recovered, no clear crime scene on rock. What they had was a body from the ice, a set of expert opinions, and a trail of behavior. It was strong circumstantial evidence, but still circumstantial. They agreed on the next step. Hart would bring Evan in for a recorded interview, this time as a person of interest in a homicide. They wanted his current version of events on tape, knowing that any shift from his 1999 statement could be critical at trial. If his answers looked evasive or inconsistent, it would help them argue intent and consciousness of guilt. Seattle police contacted Evan on October 18th and asked him to come to a station to help clarify new findings in Rachel's case. He arrived with his attorney, a criminal defense lawyer from downtown. In the interview room, Hart began with polite updates about the glacier collapse and the discovery of remains. Then he slid a photograph of the damaged skull across the table and said nothing. Evan stared at the image for several seconds without speaking. Evan finally looked up from the photograph. He did not ask if the skull belonged to Rachel. He said, "The glacier did that." His attorney put a hand on the table and told Detective Daniel Hart they would not answer questions about speculative forensic theories. Hart shifted to facts. He showed Evan a wide shot of the recovery site, then the glaciology map. He explained that experts said a body lost where Evan claimed could not surface where it was found. Evan kept his gaze on his lawyer. When Hart laid out the matching crampons, one from the ice and one from the storage unit, Evan's only comment was that he had owned a lot of gear over the years. He denied remembering losing a boot on the climb. He insisted Rachel fell into a narrow crevasse and that the rest was what the mountain did over time. When Hart pressed him about the rope, asking how he detached from a fallen partner without any injuries, the attorney ended the interview. Evan invoked his right to remain silent. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Hart walked out of the room more convinced than ever. The prosecutors agreed. In early December 2019, a Pierce County grand jury heard the case. They saw the skull photos, the crampon measurements, the glacier models, and excerpts from Rachel's emails. They also heard about Evan's pattern of control and the argument history. After 2 days of testimony, the grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder. A warrant for Evan Cole's arrest was signed the same week. Because he lived across county lines and traveled often for work, detectives set up quiet surveillance rather than immediate public arrest. They wanted to control the timing and location, aiming for a safe pickup without risk to bystanders. They watched his house, his office, and his usual commute. For several weeks, nothing changed. He kept going to work. He kept shopping at the same grocery store. He appeared, from the outside, to be living an ordinary life. Then, in late January 2020, the pattern broke. Evan missed 2 straight days at the office without calling in. His car sat in the driveway, but the house lights stayed off. Detectives went to Evan Cole's house on January 29, 2020. The blinds were closed. Mail stacked at the front door. His car still sat in the driveway. When they entered with a warrant, the scene was wrong. Closets were empty. Drawers were cleared. There were no photos on the walls, no food in the kitchen, no clothes in the hamper. It looked less like a home and more like a cleaned-out rental. Within hours, financial records filled in the rest. Over the previous 10 days, Evan had quietly moved money between accounts. Savings and investment funds were liquidated in small batches, just under reporting thresholds. The totals reached 6 figures. 2 days before he vanished from work, he wired most of it through a chain of foreign banks. The transfers ended in an account at a small institution in Central America. Travel records showed one more blow. A week before his disappearance, Evan and his longtime partner, a landscape architect named Dana Hayes, had both renewed passports. On January 27, 2020, they boarded a flight from Seattle to Los Angeles. From there, they took a late-night connection to Mexico City. After that, the trail stopped. No formal exit stamps. No further flights in their names. Pierce County issued a nationwide warrant, then sought federal help. Eventually, an Interpol red notice listed Evan as wanted for murder. Still, no confirmed sightings followed. Law enforcement agencies in several countries checked hotels and entry logs, but years passed with no solid lead. For investigators, it felt like watching a second disappearance, this time in plain view. For Laura Moore, the news landed in 2 stages. First, she was told that Rachel's remains had been found and that the medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Then, just months later, she learned that the man indicted in her sister's death had slipped away before facing a jury. She attended every public hearing she could, pushing for continued attention, for travel sanctions, for any pressure that might force Evan back into a courtroom. Rachel's case now sits in an unusual category. Officially, it is a charged homicide with a fugitive defendant. Unofficially, it is a cautionary story about how long the truth can sit inside a glacier and how quickly a person can walk away from justice. Somewhere, Evan Cole still knows what really happened on that rope in 1999.